Okay, so having gone through Britain, we're going to take France through the 1450 era uh, up to the Revolutionary era today, and then finish the rest of it later on. During the period right around 1500, this is when the French were uh, centralizing control under the monarchy during the New Monarchy period. And so we've talked about the New Monarchy period in other areas. It's basically a more centralized version of a feudal monarchy. So they're kind of adding centralized policy on top of those earlier feudal policies. And so monarchs like Francis I would have tried to hold more of that feudal territory directly, which would have given them larger armies. But the other element of new monarchy that we see in France is the building of a nation state. So it's during this era that France is able to add territory like Burgundy that had been a separate state for a long, long time. And so the modern France is beginning to form as a result of this. Francis I is also engaged in the Renaissance. He was the patron of Renaissance art that brought Leonardo da Vinci to Northern Europe. And so this is how the French came to have the Mona Lisa. And it's a kind of, he represents both of these trends during that time. So one of the examples of centralization is, and a good example of how this is still very feudal in nature, the French monarchy begins to sell off court positions. So these typically were positions we might say as a judge today. And so you would sell this position of being a judge, which was considered to be a noble position. And this creates a new class of noble known as nobles of the robe. So the nobles of the robe are essentially elevated members of the middle class. And they would have represented a challenge to the authority of your traditional warrior-based aristocracy known as the nobles of the sword. And so again, what the king is not doing is just creating a new professional bureaucracy that we would see in some countries in the age of absolutism. What the monarch is doing is using this institution of nobility, but in a new way, in a way that enhances the power of the king. The other element of new monarchy that we see in France is the levying of new taxes. The taille is a tax on consumption. It's basically an income tax, and so the old feudal system, remember, was just a service for land type of exchange. And so technically speaking, in a feudal system, there really wasn't taxation. Now, as time had gone on, taxation had been grafted onto the feudal system. But the French monarchs are beginning to institute new taxes that they can collect directly or collect through their own officials and not through the nobility. The other element of this time period is the rivalry with the Habsburgs, who ruled Austria and had held on to the position of Holy Roman Emperor for decades and decades at this point. And shortly after this, the Habsburgs are going to inherit the Spanish Empire. And so that's going to put France in between two powerful Habsburg emperors. And so the French are going to be among the leaders in ringing the alarm about what they call a universal Habsburg monarchy, that the Habsburgs are basically trying to rule all of Europe. And so the French then are going to be, from about 1500, motivated pretty strongly by secular concerns of state when it comes to the Habsburgs, more than religious concerns. So religiously, they should be allies with the Catholic Habsburgs. In practical terms, they weren't. So if we look at where all this comes from, we could see the printing of books there. And the other thing we see is the use of gunpowder weapons. So the military revolution is part of the root cause of all that. So in France, the Reformation is going to be part of that political movement to resist the power of centralizing monarchs. And so it becomes very intertwined with the political and economic issues of France in that day. And so one of the things I talked about with the Western Europe lecture is how the Reformation happens when it happens because of the commercialization of Europe. All of a sudden, being able to tax and levy monetary taxes instead of service taxes matters a whole lot more than it used to. And so that's part of the reason the Reformation happens when it does. So one of the things we need to see with France is that the monarchy of the country has a close alliance with the Catholic Church. And so as a result of the developments of the late medieval period, France had gained, the French monarchs had gained the ability to appoint their own bishops, which meant that a lot of the church's wealth was controlled by the French monarchy. And so there's a parallel here to what we would see with the Spanish. The Catholic Church and its influence and land holdings benefit the French monarchs. And so there's no reason then for the French monarchs to break away from the Catholic Church. So this creates a different dynamic then. If you were part of the French nobility, one of the ways you could stick it to the French king and reduce his influence is by breaking away from the Catholic Church. And so while broadly speaking, there's not much of an incentive to break away from the Catholic Church, for certain nobles, especially those nobles far away from the monarch's capital, there could be an incentive to break away. Now, John Calvin, though, represents more of the Martin Luther school of Reformation patterns, in that John Calvin, like Luther, read the Bible himself and then disagreed with the church's interpretation. Calvin, to a greater degree than other thinkers, focused on the all-powerful, all-knowing nature of God. And his conclusion was that there was no such thing as free will. Everything had been predestined. And so that kind of a downer. He believed as well that most people were predestined to go to hell. But it's a positive religion in that, since human nature is to think the best of oneself, many people believe they were what Calvin referred to as the elect. And the other part of it that was positive is that Calvin emphasizes the value of work in the eyes of God. And so that meant if you were a merchant and you accumulated a lot of wealth, you were actually doing what God wanted you to do. This was not sinful as it was held by some Catholic theologians. So that made it attractive to merchants in particular. So we can see there the chart, 1519, before Calvin comes along, no Huguenots. And then by the time we fast forward about 40 years, we have over 1 million Huguenots. And that's still a small percentage of the overall population, which is close to 20 million at that point. But it is a religion on the rise. And this represents a political challenge to the monarchy. This is what we're seeing here. And so what happens, broadly speaking, is we get this Catholic Reformation, the Catholic Church trying to reassert itself. That heightens the tension between different religious groups, and we end up with religious conflict. So in France, these are known as the French Wars of Religion. And these are on-again, off-again conflicts. And so we would kind of hit the high points of what's happening here. So remember that this is surface level a religious conflict. Huguenots, French Calvinists, versus the Catholic monarchs, the Valois monarchs of France. This is also, though, a political conflict. And even some of the very fervent believers in one form of Christianity or the other were trying to position their families so that they would have more influence. So kind of looking at this, at the causes here, what happens is Henry II, the Valois king, dies in one of these jousting tournaments that were held from time to time as a remnant of feudal chivalry. And this opens the door for nobles looking to reassert themselves. And so we have different factions then at play here. So Huguenots, these French Calvinists, were a combination then of merchants who found the religion appealing and nobles, especially in the southern part of France, who were looking to assert greater independence from the king. So the Huguenots see this as a chance to accomplish all of these different things simultaneously. You can push back against weak kings. So when Henry II dies, he actually has plenty of male heirs. The problem is that when he dies, there's still children. And so his wife, Catherine, one of the Medicis, is going to rule as the regent. And so this is where the monarchy is particularly weak. And so the Navarres in the southern part, who are mostly Huguenot, they're going to look to assert themselves, and in several other leading families. On the Catholic side, the Guise family is going to make a move to become the power behind the throne. So then politically, what we see here is one of the patterns of this period, where nobles are using this using religion as an excuse to resist centralizing tendencies of the monarch. In the same way that we already talked about in England, the English monarchs are using religion as an excuse to centralize greater power in their hands. And so this goes in both directions. So kind of the big events of the period, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, you can see the drop in the number of Huguenots in France by 1600. Now that wasn't entirely due to the massacre, but what the massacre does on top of all the rest of it is it drives Huguenots out of the country if they can afford to leave. And so the Huguenots are never again, after St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, going to be the type of influential minority that they were in the mid-1500s. But the war drags on and on and on. And finally, we get to this part of the conflict that's known as the War of the Three Henrys: Henry of Navarre, Henry of Guise, and Henry III. And when Henry III is assassinated by a Catholic monk, then this creates a succession crisis, because the closest heir to the throne was Henry of Navarre. He was related multiple ways to the Valois family, through his mother most directly. And so the throne had to pass to him, but he was a Huguenot. Well, Henry of Navarre doesn't take religion all that seriously. And when we went over him earlier in the year, we talked about how he's born a Catholic, he converts to Protestantism. Then at the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, he's captured, and they give him a choice. He can convert or die. He converts to Catholicism. Then he escapes. He converts back to being a Huguenot. And now his choice is he can become Catholic and be king, or he can remain Protestant and the Civil War will go on. So the quote that's attributed to him at this point is, "Paris is well worth a mass. He converts to Catholicism and is crowned Henry IV." The problem here is that most of the people in France are Catholic, but you still have this sizable Protestant minority who now thinks that Henry may be a sellout. So he issues the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes declares in 1599 that Catholicism is the state religion of France, but that Huguenots are free to practice in certain areas of France. And so this is a great example of the changing political landscape in France. Henry IV cares much less about religious unity and sees religion less of a tool of the monarchy in enhancing its power. And he sees it more as an obstacle, this religious unity. And so what he values more then is the power of the French state. He would rather reduce this religious compulsion on people, take it away, and enhance France's power to field a military by drawing from all groups of people, then have the one unified religion. And Elizabeth of England is much the same way. While she has a state religion, she cares much less about enforcing that state religion than she does about making England a powerful state. And so this is one of the currents of the late Reformation. When Henry IV takes power, he is one of the famous and most beloved kings in French history. One of the quotes that's attributed to him is the kind of a chicken in every pot type of mentality for the peasants. And what happens is he's assassinated by a Catholic. And so then we end up with a succession. Louis XIII becomes the king. He's not that wild about running the show. And so the person who's more important in his reign is Cardinal Richelieu, who's the prime minister. And Richelieu is another centralizing figure who is much more concerned about political power than anything religiously. So Richelieu, this Catholic cardinal in a country where Catholicism is a state religion, sides with the Protestants in the 30 Years' War. He first funds the armies of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, who was a Protestant, and then he enters the war directly. And so ultimately, when the 30 Years' War ends, it's considered to be the death knell for these religious conflicts. You know, wars are fought for reasons of sovereignty and state competition. So that competition between nobles during the French Wars of Religion had destabilized the country for decades. And so Henry IV wasn't the only one who valued peace and state power over any kind of religious issue. Many members of the middle class felt like if you could invest power in a monarch, then they could maintain peace, which would be good for business. And so this is what is going to lead us to the absolutism of Louis XIV. So what we see as a background, what's leading into this, is one, the commercialization, the global trade, which has greatly enlarged and enriched France's middle class. So if we were to go back even a century, and we look to the new monarchs, while they could sometimes bring in members of the middle class and use them as robe nobles, by the time we get to Louis XIV, right around 1650, the French middle class is so much larger that he has a much greater ability to replace the nobility with members of that middle class because of France's commercialization. Now, the other thing that's happened is the religious wars, which have discredited these noble families. They are seen to be the cause of that instability. And then we have that military revolution again. At this point, what we have are large infantry forces that have to be well trained and are increasingly using muskets. And so the only power in France that could afford that kind of military was the monarchy. And so there's this pressure then to centralize under a strong king. So what Louis XIV does is he centralizes France politically by appointing regional governors called intendants. Those intendants were often drawn from the middle class. So to a large degree, what he is attempting to do is deprive the nobles of their traditional political responsibilities. And so the famous example is Louis XIV requiring nobles to come to Versailles for at least certain parts of the year. And so the exchange that's going on there is that nobles have enhanced social standing because they're living in the king's palace, and they have enhanced tax breaks because they don't have to pay the tithe, the income tax, but they are deprived of political power. So they're not going to be happy about that, but Louis XIV is so powerful he's able to make it work. What I have just said here represents an oversimplification, and there are political scientists and historians that have pushed back against that, and they've said that what France has is too venal to be true political centralization. Venal refers to something that is based on bribery and purchasing of positions. And so even under Louis XIV, there was still a good deal of selling of positions or selling of responsibilities, as we'll see in just a minute. But down in the left-hand corner, you have the great example of how this works in theory, where Louis XIV has invited the nobles to his palace and enhanced their social standing by allowing them to engage in daily events like the levee, when the king gets ready and they can help the king get dressed, which was a sign of great prestige. The closer you were to the king, the greater your social standing. While on the flip side of that, distracting them from political responsibilities. Economic centralization occurs under the mercantilist policies of the man we could really call the finance minister of Louis XIV, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Now, Colbert isn't able to create a modern centralized economy. The map in the bottom middle of France shows the tax farms that France was divided into. So what they have done is not taken direct control using professional bureaucrats over taxation, but sold off the right to tax farmers. And in between those areas, you would still have taxes, tolls on goods. So the one exception to this is the giant tax farming zone around Paris. And this was known as the 5 free farms because you didn't have to pay those tolls. But Jean-Baptiste Colbert engages in your traditional mercantilist policies. He uses government subsidies to encourage manufacturing like silk production. He uses government subsidies to encourage colonization. He tries to discourage, through tariffs, the import of foreign goods. And all of this works fine if France isn't increasing its expenditures, as it could do by fighting a war. So Colbert is even able to finance Louis's palace building, which was extremely expensive. The Versailles Palace cost about $2 billion in today's currency. So tax farming I've mentioned already. The expansion of the colonial empire, France is looking to expand into North America, New France, so what's today Canada and Louisiana, and in places like India. And so much like the British, this was sometimes handled by the state, but often handled as well by companies. So in the case of India, it was really French joint stock companies competing with British joint stock companies, and the French state competing with the British state. Religiously, what Louis XIV does is he revokes the Edict of Nantes. And so he is powerful enough that he makes that work. The Huguenots in France are now given a choice. They can convert, or there will be various penalties. Now, he's not going to kill them, but he will do things like take their children away and have them raised by a Catholic family. So once again, what this means is that anybody who has the means to do so is going to remain Huguenot and leave. And that's going to be some of the most productive merchants and artisans in France. And they will flee to a country that's offering religious freedom, which is the Netherlands. And so that's going to be bad news because Louis XIV has also engaged in a whole series of wars. And so for his reign, this is almost perpetual. And this is what breaks Colbert's system. Louis XIV is not presiding over a modern enough system to support this kind of warfare. Whereas the Dutch, that have developed innovations in modern banking, they can finance these wars. And then the British in 1688, when Britain is then ruled by a Protestant monarch, they're going to develop the Bank of England, and they'll be able to finance these wars, these kinds of wars too. France, on the other hand, has this mercantilist system that is able to establish more or less self-sufficiency if there aren't large expenditures on conflict. And so what France will do instead is borrow money. And so because they don't have a bank to finance all of those loans, they end up doing things like abrogating the loans, where they just announce they're not going to pay back the money. And so it becomes harder and harder and harder to get the money until eventually it bankrupts the French state. That's about a century after this. So the consistent wars are fought against the Habsburgs in Austria and the Dutch. And so you can see the map to the top right, or top middle, the areas that Louis is able to gain. This is at tremendous expense. But the big conflict is the War of the Spanish Succession, when Louis XIV's grandson inherits the Spanish throne, and Louis XIV begins to try to incorporate that territory into the French Empire. That imbalances the balance of power. The Europeans form a coalition, what's known as the Grand Alliance of England, the Netherlands, Prussia, and Austria against France, and Louis XIV is defeated. So, nevertheless, Louis XIV is the conqueror of his day, and he is seen by the Germans as the invader, the threat. He destroyed virtually all of the German castles along the Rhine River. And so the perception we have to kind of get in our minds is of France as the threat to the balance of power. France as the aggressor, France in the German mind as the invader, again and again and again and again. The political scientist Francis Fukuyama has labeled French absolutism as weak absolutism. Normally not how we think about it, especially in the European context. But what he means is that compared to Russian absolutism, and compared in particular to Chinese absolutism, the French king isn't all that absolute. And so here is Louis XIV writing instructions to his heir, talking about how he has to get money from the provincial estates. So while France didn't have a national legislature that could challenge the king, there were these old feudal institutions that the king couldn't just dispense with. The king still had to use. So while a strong king like Louis XIV can override the privileges of groups like the provincial estates, it's going to be difficult for the kings that inherit this position to do the same thing. And so you're sitting on a ticking time bomb, right? There are all kinds of cracks in the system. It's not as absolute as you would think, and it has all kinds of financial problems. All right, so we had Louis XIV engaged in what was, to some degree, a global conflict in the War of the Spanish Succession, because the war involved the Spanish Empire and the Americas. But by the 18th century, we were going to see true world wars as a result of the rivalry between France and Britain in particular. And so the Seven Years' War is the great example of this. On the continent of Europe, France and Austria and eventually Russia are going to team up to try to wipe Prussia off the map. A move that would enable the French to gain territory along the Rhine in Germany and deal a death blow to Austria's great rival. And on top of that, what the French are going to find themselves in is a war in India and in North America. By this time, the British have adopted a policy under their Prime Minister Pitt of financing wars against France on the continent using the rising revenues coming from British trade and manufacturing, while using their navy to pick off French possessions abroad. In most wars, this resulted in what was basically a tie. That's what happens in the War of the Austrian Succession. The British are forced to give back most of their gains outside of Europe in order to get the French to give up their gains on the continent of Europe. But the 7 Years' War is different, because the French are stymied on the continent. Frederick the Great is able to hold them off enough. Their alliance with Austria isn't all that solid. Meanwhile, the British make huge gains in India and in North America. And so this is a humiliating defeat for the French at the end of this. And it generates a lot of debt. So what we have kind of going on along with this is population is on the rise. And the French, unlike the British and the Dutch, haven't done much to modernize their economic system. So their economic system is still very labor intensive and dependent on lots of land being in cultivation. So as Columbian Exchange crops come over, remember these crops are not traded. It was too expensive to cross the ocean for somebody to trade potatoes. But the idea of cultivating the potato spreads from the Americas. And as the potato is cultivated more and more and more, population begins to rise more rapidly. Well, the feudal system is not built for a rapidly growing population. The feudal system isn't built for the commercial system that accompanies the Columbian Exchange. And so increasingly there are social and economic challenges to the status quo. So one of those is going to be that the middle class, we're talking about a range of wealth here. The middle class could be well off, but not rich, right? It could be talking about an artisan owning a shop. But we can go all the way up to middle-class bankers who could be spectacularly wealthy, and yet they are essentially legally discriminated against in the feudal system. The feudal system gave by law the nobles special privileges and access to certain jobs. So this middle-class wealth and the education that accompanies it, is the product of commercialization, is going to be destabilizing as well. I've mentioned this lack of a central bank. There was a time when the French toyed with the idea of creating a central bank, briefly do, but it doesn't take root. And so the kind of have a convergence of different things coming into play here. You have the debt from war that can't be financed by a bank. You have the changing economic landscape caused by commercialization and Atlantic trade. Population growing, a larger middle class that's not content with the way things are, and then all of these groups are given voice by the Enlightenment. And remember, France is the center of this Enlightenment movement, and Paris in particular is at the center of it. And several French figures are going to be critical in the development. So if we go back a little bit to the scientific revolution, during that period, Descartes had come out against the British approach to inductive reasoning. Descartes argues that you could know everything through reason alone, and you didn't need inductive reasoning in order to figure things out. So in other words, you didn't need experience, you could just use your ability to think. And so that's going to inform a variety of French thinkers. Then within France, we have the salons, which were the areas where people would come together, mainly in aristocratic households, and discuss the Enlightenment ideas of the day. It was a way of circumventing the control over publications exercised by absolute rulers. So just to kind of hit the highlights, we have Voltaire, who is going to argue that the state should not control religion, that the state, broadly speaking, shouldn't try to regulate freedom of thought at all. But in particular, he's going to target the French state's regulation of religion as being a sign of despotism in France. And so it's irrational, he argues, to try to force people to believe things they don't want to believe. Diderot, publishing the encyclopedia, along with those salons, is going to help to popularize these Enlightenment ideas. And so remember, the encyclopedia was expensive. Not many people had encyclopedias, but articles in the encyclopedia were often published on their own. And so there's this popularization of the Enlightenment that occurs as a result of the encyclopedia. And then we have a transitional figure in Rousseau. And Rousseau relates to all these topics. So one of the Enlightenment debates is over the role of women. And so we talked about with the British lecturer Wollstonecraft arguing that women could reason, they just needed better education. Well, what Rousseau argues is that women are naturally inclined to take care of children. They are more emotional and not as capable of reasoning. And so this is the Enlightenment argument for women to remain subordinated to men. As far as children goes, what Rousseau argues is that children need to undergo this emotional development before they can undergo rational training. And so that is going to impact child rearing. Along with some of the other changes in Europe, the result of this will be that Europeans rely less on things like beatings than before. And there's more caring approach to child rearing than before. Rousseau argues with the social contract is that the government that's formed should be formed in order to act according to the general will. The general will is what is good for society as a whole. It is not what is good for the majority. It is what is good for society as a unit. Well, that's difficult to say. And so what Rousseau kind of opened the door for is for governments to assert that they are acting according to the general will. And this is going to have a tremendous influence on the French Revolution and on the European revolutionary movements that follow, as various revolutionary groups are going to claim that they know what the general will is, and therefore that they need to eliminate their enemies as opponents of the general will. So by the time we get to Rousseau, he's a transitional figure between the Enlightenment and the Romantic period that will come later. So all of these challenges to the status quo will lead to the French Revolution in 1789. And so the kind of bigger picture, we talked about the literate public. Remember that you have this absolute, this system of absolute monarchy by the time we get to 1789 that is using Enlightenment rhetoric itself in order to make the government more efficient. And this is opening Pandora's box. Once you tell people that government should be more rational and efficient, then you kind of open the door for people to look for other reforms that might make the government more rational and responsive. In spite of all that has changed, we still have periodic regional famines in Europe, and these were often caused by crop failures. In the 1780s, we have a series of crop failures. So in the commercial system that has evolved in Europe, many people now are wage earners, and a lot of those wage earners are concentrated in cities. The periodic famines are going to cause the prices of bread to spike, and so that is going to lead to a corresponding spike in discontent. So the financial problems of the government, the Enlightenment thought, the growth of the middle class and this literate public, the shift to wage earning, and the periodic famines all converge to cause the revolution. So the King of France at this point, Louis XVI, summons the Estates General. The Estates General is this feudal institution that gives more say to the nobles and to the church than to the middle class. The Third Estate breaks away, declares itself to be its own legislature, and that is going to snowball. And so where the revolution really begins, in that we have elements from all parts of French society joining together against the regime, is the storming of the Bastille. So within a few months, the regime has gone from being absolute and basically feudal in its makeup to the absolute monarchy being limited by these kind of revolts, the feudal system being abolished, the Catholic Church being nationalized, women playing a role. You see there the picture of the storming of the March on Versailles. So all of this is the moderate phase. France at this point goes from being an absolute monarchy to a limited monarchy in 1791. But in spite of that name, moderate, much has changed. The social system has totally been transformed. The legal distinctions that come from feudalism are gone. And the people of France have gone from not being able to vote in national elections at all to now having a regular say in national elections. The issue here is going to be, has the revolution gone far enough? And this is where revolutionaries are going to disagree. Some people are going to say it's gone far enough. Some people are going to say it's gone too far. Some people are going to say it still needs to progress. That's what's going to lead to a radical phase. So you have an event that's referred to in French history as the Second Revolution, where the people of Paris stormed the king's palace and put him under house arrest, stormed the legislature and forced the cancellation, the abrogation of that constitution. And that initiates that radical phase of the revolution, where revolutionaries are going to kill each other. Right? So we have the execution of Louis XVI as a traitor during the radical phase, and we have probably most famously the Reign of Terror, where the Committee of Public Safety is set up to go after supposed counter-revolutionaries. And there we have the guillotine up there to kill those people in an enlightened way, right? As they're not going to suffer, the thinking goes, if their head is chopped off so quickly. And tens of thousands of people are executed. It would have been more had they been able to manage it. But that's the radical phase. Now, it's during this period, though, that the French people come to see the state as truly acting on their behalf. A republic is declared. There's universal male suffrage. And so when the government of France calls for a levée en masse, a draft. It is widely supported against the absolute monarchies of Austria and Prussia. And so people come to see themselves as fighting for their country. The state represents the country. So this is the nation state. That's emerging during this radical phase. But ultimately, the Committee of Public Safety is seen as going too far. And Robespierre, who was something of a dictator during that time, is arrested, executed himself. And so what we end up with is one-man rule. So in 1799, Napoleon overthrows the Republic and becomes the first consul. Within 5 years, he goes from being first consul to consul for life to emperor of France. And so he's now a new monarch. But these reforms, these changes to the political system, are broadly supported because of his domestic changes. So the Napoleonic Code, most people in France would have supported as protecting private property, as consolidating the gains of the Third Estate with the abolition of feudalism. He establishes a national bank for France, which brings inflation under control. And so finally, people could afford bread in France. So Napoleon was a hero at that point to the French people. And so his changes to the Constitution to gain more and more power were broadly supported by the French populace. It's his foreign policy that is his undoing, because Napoleon's answer to every foreign policy challenge was, well, let's just fight a battle, and I'll bring on a decisive battle, I'll win, and then I can dictate the terms of the peace. What would have been far more effective for him in the long run, after winning the initial decisive battles that kind of set the stage for the peace he wanted, would have been to make concessions. I mean, France didn't need to control all of Italy. Napoleon could have conceded parts of Italy to the Austrians in order to make a more enduring peace. And so France then is essentially worn down by the constant conflicts that Napoleon engages in. So while he does win spectacular victories, as we get closer to 1812, those victories are harder to come by. Now the countries opposing France are able to tap into this newly growing nationalism. Winning a single decisive battle was often not enough. Napoleon had to destroy his opponent's armies before they would make peace. And when he attempts to do this to the Russians, invading Russia for no other reason than to enforce the continental system, which silly, right? You know, what's the most he's going to get? He's going to get the Russians temporarily refusing to trade with the British. He's not going to destroy Britain. He's not going to stop the Russians from eventually going back to trade with the British. And so this foreign policy is going to do him in. He's defeated at the Battle of Leipzig, which ends up costing him the throne the first time. And then he's defeated again at the Battle of Waterloo, which cost him the throne the second time. But this is the watershed of French history and European history more generally, because absolutism is on the way out as a result of this. Feudalism is on the way out as a result of this. And there's going to be a shift in the way governments operate. And no longer are you going to have His Majesty's government. Increasingly, we're going to see European states talk in terms of nation states. And so the Napoleonic Code is able to endure after Napoleon because it's so rational, it's so well organized, it's so effective. And that's really all that matters. It's not about being associated with a particular monarchy. All right, so I'll stop there with French history and we'll wrap up the rest of it next time.